Now we're going to talk about configuring application access. Application registration is how you can enable your users to use their Microsoft 365 credentials to access software as a service applications from third-party vendors. Only members of the Global Administrator, Cloud Application Administrator, or Application Administrator roles can configure application registration. It's managed by the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. And to get you started, you can choose an app from the gallery or create your own. Now I'm going to show you an example of registering a third-party application. So now we're going to take a look at adding a third-party app to Azure AD. And this can take a lot of different forms, but I'm going to do something pretty fundamental. I'm going to add Amazon AWS to use single sign-on with Azure AD. So in other words, I want to use Azure AD as my identity provider for Amazon AWS. And so in order to do this, I'm going to go and find the AWS single sign-on service here in the Azure AD gallery and go ahead and create it. And now I have some back and forth to do. I'm going to start by assigning some users and groups, and specifically, I'm going to add myself. Use this. And now I have to configure single sign-on, and I'm going to say, I want to use SAML, and I'm going to edit my basic SAML configuration. And as you can see, what I need to do now is fill in things like an entity ID and sign-in URL and things like that. Those are all things I can do manually, but what I'm going to do instead is go and enable it on the AWS side and get a metadata file that I'm going to upload. So here I am in the AWS Management Console. I'm signed in as an admin who can configure this stuff in AWS. So I'm going to go to AWS Single Sign-On, which I have already enabled, and I'm going to choose my identity source. Now, in this case, my identity source is currently, you can see, configured to use AWS SSO. In other words, it's built-in single sign-on. So I'm going to change this, and I'm going to say I want to use an external identity provider and click Next. And this provides me with my download, as you can see, for my metadata file. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to download my service provider metadata, which I will keep. And now switching back over to Azure AD, I'll upload my metadata file. So I'll go ahead and browse and select that file. Here it is. And as you can see, that fills in all my information. So it gives me my entity ID and reply URL and all the stuff that I need. So I'll go ahead and save that. Okay, so I'm going to test this later. I want to do a little bit more configuring here now, because now what I want to do is do it the other way around. So now I want to set up AWS single sign-on. So I'll go ahead and click on this, which will allow me to download a federation file, see here, and switch over to AWS SSO. So see, I'm still on this page for configuring my external identity provider. So now I can go and choose that file that I just downloaded from AWS. Okay, and now I'm going to say, yep, I'm going to review and confirm. So I need to type accept here and change the identity source. Okay. So now I've changed my identity source. Now at this point, I could go and start manually configuring users, but what I want to do instead is enable automatic provisioning. So what I can say is when I provision users in Azure AD, I want to be able to automatically provision them here as well. So I'm going to enable that. And what I need to do now is do a little more configuration. So I need to copy this URL, which is the endpoint that Azure AD is going to use. So I'm going to copy that and just make a note of it elsewhere. And then I have to get my access token and make a note of that as well, because as you can see here, it's only going to give me access to it once. Once I close this, it'll be gone. So I need to make sure that I've got both of these things logged. And now I'm going to close this up and switch back over to Azure AD again. And here in Azure AD, I'm going to switch now to the provisioning blade and get started here and set my provisioning mode to automatic. And this is where I need that URL and that token from AWS. So I'm going to go ahead and paste this in here. Here's the token. test my connection and make sure that, yep, I'm able to do that, which I am. Okay, and now as you can see, it's going to allow me to provision both Azure AD groups and Azure AD users dynamically and send an email notification if I want. I'm going to leave this the way that it is. And we'll go back now and try it out. So I'm going to go ahead and test this. And in fact, I was successful. So I was able to use my Azure AD identity to successfully get a token from AWS. So that means that now I can use Azure AD as my identity provider for all of my AWS applications. If you need to provide cloud-based access to an on-prem application, you can configure an application proxy. This means there's no need to update your on-prem applications. With an application proxy, your on-prem applications can use Azure AD authentication controls, security analytics, multi-factor authentication, conditional access policies, and more. Application proxy does not require inbound ports to be opened on your organization's perimeter firewall, nor does it require on-prem deployment of additional appliances. Here's a high-level overview of how the application proxy works. The user accesses the application through an endpoint and is directed to the Azure AD sign-in page. Upon successful sign-in, Azure AD sends a token to the user's client device. The client then sends the token to the application proxy service, which retrieves the user principal name and security principal name from the token. The application proxy then sends the request to the application proxy connector. If SSO is configured, then the connector performs any additional authentication required on behalf of the user. The connector sends the request to the on-premises application, and a response is returned through the connector and application proxy service to the user. To configure an application proxy, you start by selecting Application Proxy in the Azure AD portal, clicking Download Connector Service, running the install wizard, and then verifying that the services are running.